I am a professor at the University of Montana, and I teach. I was not hired to teach language. I teach classes in political anthropology and Native American studies. My father's name was Robert, and my mother's name was Clarissa. My father traveled a lot, and I don't know how this happened, but I wound up getting boarded out. I wasn't actually with my family as a nuclear family until I was somewhere around, I think 5 or probably 6 years old. Because I think even at 5 years old, I know at 5 years old when I entered kindergarten, I would have been in kindergarten, I was not with my family. And that was, as a child, that was a painful time of my life. But also around that time, I think my earliest recollection of family was a summer that I was with my grandfather. And I sometimes tell the story about how my grandfather dealt with me as a child. And it was a much different way than what you see today. I was very, I guess if I were a child today, they would have had me on Ritalin or something, whatever they do to keep kids from running around crazy. But my grandfather, he would tell me stories. And when he would tell stories, I always remember him with a block of wood and a knife, and he would whittle. And I knew that at the end of the story, he would have made, like a horse or something, and it was mine, as long as I sat still and listened to the story. And it was really, as a child watching that, he always had my attention because I would watch him create this object that then became mine, that then took on a life because I played with it, and children, animate things. And so I was watching him create, some life out of a block of wood, and it was just amazing to watch. So he never had to, chastise me or scold me or threaten me. He would just tell me stories. And I would use those stories as a young adult, like in my late teens and college, and as a parent. I would tell those stories because they had really deep meaning. And so those are some of my earliest memories of growing up. My father was a good father, but he wasn't, he didn't do the kinds of things that I saw some other fathers, where they were playing with their children and stuff like that. So my uncle, my uncle probably had the most, outside of my grandfather, my uncle probably had the most influence on me, and that was Rutherford Lone Man. And he's, that family's from here. And he kind of took me under his wing, cared for me. I got stories from him as well. I'm not sure how much I should speak about him because, he was a road man, and I guess everybody knew that anyhow. And he just had this interesting perspective on life and philosophy and way of explaining things. And he would explain things to me. He'd say things like, he always called me son. He'd say, there's in everything there's something that you can learn from anything, even a blade of grass, and all you have to do is be still and listen for the lesson. And it was things like that. And I think one of the strongest lessons I got out of him was he got me up early in the morning. He told me, get up, go to bed early. We're going to get up early in the morning. And it was just around that time when the sun was cresting. And he brought me to this pond, and it wasn't that far from here. And it had an overhang. And so the bankment hung over the pond. And he said, so everything was really very still. There was no wind at that time of the morning on that particular day. And it was very still, and the pond itself was very, very still, very flat. And he told me, pick up a stone. But he said, hold it over the pond. And so, I walked to the edge and held it over the pond. He said, now drop it. And I dropped it. He said, now tell me what you see. And so after I dropped it, and I said, well, the stone hit the water and it made circles. And the circles, and he said, well, what did the circles do? I said, they moved along the surface of the water. And what he said to me next was really, really profound. And he said, I want you to always remember this, that nothing is so small that it cannot set something greater than itself in motion. And he said the stone hit the pond of the water, and it caused the ripples to move out, and those ripples caused things around the edge of that pond to move. And that was the lesson. I'm Native from my father's side. I'm Arapaho from my father's side. My mother, while I was raised by my mother, and she was a very good mother, and I was very close to her, always very close. Her mother actually descended from Taino, I think that's how you pronounce it, which are a group of Native people in between South America and North America somewhere. And I only met her once. And when I met her, she didn't speak much English, so I didn't know much about her. But my mother, she was in a foster care for a while. And so I don't know that she had much grounding culturally, even with her mother's culture. So what has come to me has come through my father's side and his mother and father and extended family branching out. But aside from that, my mother was a very understanding mother and loving mother like any other mother. And the world just was different then. My mother didn't dote over me. There's funny stories that I remember as a child where, I said I was very energetic, and I remember once my mother had this new coffee table, and it sat between two couches, and I would jump from one couch to the other couch over the coffee table. And that was interesting for a while, and I thought, this is kind of boring, I can do this. So I decided I could see how lightly I could touch the coffee table, on the way over. And one of the times it wasn't that light, and I broke it. And my mother went to the kitchen, and she started pulling out all the pots and pans. And I thought, I'm really got my mother upset. She's moving away. She was just storing up ammunition. and she had a pile, and she started throwing them at me. And then that was fun. It was a game. I was like ducking behind the coffee table. It was like a game. So, this was my childhood. Everything sort of was like fun and exciting, even when I was getting pots and pans thrown at me. People talk about teaching culture. Teachers go, we're going to teach culture today. And it's like, no, that really isn't how it works. And I think the best story that I have about that is one that Gloria Fogden told me. And Gloria Fogden is Mohawk. She's still alive. She's Mohawk. And she said when she was 12 years old, here she's living in a Mohawk community that's very traditional, still have their the festivals, the Green Corn Festival, Strawberry Festival, and she spoke Mohawk and involved. So she's 12 years old. They're having a Strawberry Festival, and when they're at this festival, she said these men came out of the forest. So the Mohawk Reservation at Akwesasne is on Cornwall Island between Canada and kind of straddling Canada and New York. And she said these men came out of the woods. And she looked at them and hid behind her mother and said, "Those are Indians," and she was afraid. And the thing was, here this woman has grown up in very traditional setting with language, and she did not see the connection of herself as a Native person to the culture, but she saw these men coming out of the woods who were looking pretty rugged, I guess, and she hid behind her mother and was frightened, and she said, "Those are Indians." So this idea that we inherently know our culture is not quite there. We grow up in our culture, and we get to a point in our lives where we understand aspects, or if we have grown up ceremonially, we understand those ceremonies, and we understand the meaning of them and how they relate to our lives and the underlying message of them. And that's when all of this comes together. But as youth, a 13-year-old is running around being a 13-year-old. And I know stories that go way back to the 1800s about the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and about youth. And the youth were kicking up the same way. They weren't thinking about, oh, well, I'm Native and, I have to be stoic or something like that. They were kicking up the same way and getting into trouble and taking joy rides on horses that belonged to somebody else and, all sorts of stuff. I spent time in Norman, Oklahoma, the outskirts of Norman, Oklahoma. I had relatives up at Greenfield, Julia and Anthony Davis, and I spent some time, in that home, and that's where I got Arapaho from her. And she would, but it was interesting. I remember when I was in school and I was, able to drive and get out there and visit with her, because I was interested in the language. She would always wait until late at night. And my recollection has always been when the language started happening, it was always late at night. We were in the kitchen, at the kitchen table. Everyone was asleep. There was one light on in the house. And she would always talk the language in whispers. And I never really knew why that was the case. I don't know if she had been in a boarding school or what, and the language was something that was sort of taboo. But she had a quiet voice anyhow. But it seemed during those times she just was whispering the language. So I did diving in high school, and I got very, very good at it. And that kind of people in college took an interest in me, and that's when they started. We'd have meets, and people would say, "Oh, well, you're going to college," and stuff like that. And so I sort of started thinking about it at that point. And basically it was, well, I also did track and field. I ran a lot. And so the sports was the kind of window or doorway, pathway that brought me into college. And when I got to college, even then I had this strong interest in the state of the language. So I started moving my focus and studies into areas that dealt with cultural issues and language issues. And so those were the things that I studied, and eventually started looking at classes that dealt with linguistic study, and that branched out into the kinds of things that I do now. Going through college, I worked my way through school. And because I worked my way through school, I was very kind of smart about it. I didn't like getting in debt, and so I was pretty good at not getting loans. I got some grants and things like that, but my family basically didn't have the money to help me, so I just put myself through school. When I was in college, I wound up deciding that I was going to do a dictionary of Arapaho. And I decided I was going to work with some people up at Wind River. I don't know why I made that decision. But when I called up there, some people told me, well, there's somebody coming out that's going to do a dictionary. And they gave me his number. And so I found out it was this linguist guy, Zednik Salzman. So he was nice enough to invite me on to do a dictionary with him. So when I started doing that, that's when I shifted over into speaking Arapaho the way they do in Wind River, and that's I guess the dialect that I actually use more now. Language shapes how we bring meaning to the world. So the way we logically think, the way we rationalize things that happen around us or that we see, is shaped through our language, basically. So when a person is born, they have no language, they have no real view of the world, they see things, but they have no understanding of really what they're looking at. And slowly language starts bringing meaning and understanding to those things. And it's all, people kind of get bothered when I say this, but it's all symbolic. There's no real rhyme or reason why dog is called dog. If there was, then dog would be dog in every language, every culture, I should say. But it's not. And so things, we see something, and then we label it, and then that creates a relationship. And through interrelationships of how we label things, we bring greater meaning to things. So when I was growing up, I'd always hear also the older people talk about all sorts of things and all sorts of things that were important to them that also was very superstitious at that time. There was a lot of superstition that was running around when I was quite young that I would hear that was very meaningful and important for that generation. And even today, here's a good example. My grandmother had an ice box, and somebody would come and put ice, 50-pound or 100-pound or 75-pound, somewhere in there, ice down a chute, and it would go somewhere that I never saw, other than I knew it was an ice box. So today, I never call a refrigerator a refrigerator. It's always an ice box. And my children think that's very odd. And I always just say icebox. I mean, I can say refrigerator, obviously, but I use icebox. In Arapaho, I can say chinoa. And that can mean, that can be telling someone to pour something, like a command almost. You pour it. But in a different setting, that same expression with no different inflex or inflection or whatever will mean quit dancing. So depending upon settings, those things influence how we see things. Here's another example. Ni cha wu. That's salt. And I teach a class at the university called Culture is Expressed Through Language. And one day I wrote this word on the board, ni cha wu. And I've used that word growing up with my children. I've used it thousands and thousands and thousands of times. But it was for the first time I heard the word. And I went, this is interesting. At the end of that word is awu. And that is referring to something that is in a state of like liquefaction. And I thought, this is odd. I mean, salt, yeah, you talk about pouring salt, but it's not a liquid. So I went down to the Wind River. I had happened to be there because I was looking over the immersion preschool there. And I sought out an elder and I said, "This word, Neyooxet, what does it mean?" And he goes, "Well, it means salt." I said, I know it means salt, but it has another meaning." He goes, "Well, it means salt." I don't know what you're looking for. I said, "Well, if you hear the end of that word, wu, that refers to a body of water or something being in a state of liquidness." And he goes, "No, no, no, no." And he really knew better because ha'awu, they debate this word all the time. Ha'awu has to do with house, but it also has to do with basa'awu, has to do with big lake. That word big lake, and that's the word for one of the Great Lakes. So he knew that, but he was, I don't know, maybe he was not having a good day, but it was like, no, it means salt, it means salt. But it also indicates how when you're not in the language, your frame of reference shifts. So when you're speaking English 98% of the time, you're thinking in English. So when I threw this at him, his brain didn't shift. So out of desperation, or kind of grabbing for anything I could grab for, I asked him, "What's the name of that lake in Utah?" And he kind of stopped, dropped his head, and went, "Neyooxet." So what that told me in that one moment was, one, the word for salt was not a word that came into being for the Arapaho when salt came to them from Europeans. It had been there all along. If I say, "Kani chettoa," do you like the taste of something? And someone would say, "Ha, Neyooxet." That means it tastes good, Neyooxet. Well, that's the first part of Neyooxet awu. So I started looking at the components of this word, Neyooxet awu. So Neyooxet, it tastes good, body of water. That doesn't make sense. What is this all about? And I looked at it deeper, and it's like, no, it's not that it tastes good. Salt doesn't taste good. It's referring to salt having a function and being good for the body, some aspect of salt. And we all know salt is important. Animals use salt licks. And so the language is bringing meaning, and that deals with health aspects to a certain degree. And you can see that in other aspects with language. Language gives you information about the world you live in. The Yuchi out at Sapulpa, they were down to about 8 speakers. Most of them were in their late 60s, early 70s. They are generating new speakers when they were down to about 6. The Taloa in California were down to about 6 speakers. Similar kind of story. One individual who studied the language at Berkeley, I believe, Taloa, he made it his mission to raise his children in the language, and those 3 children now have children, and they are the ones who are bringing the language back. Further down the coast, the Hupa, one individual there, he's the youngest speaker in that community. He's about maybe in his mid-30s or early 30s. He's doing incredible things with the language. So, yes, there is hope. As far as the state, I mentioned earlier, what I have seen as far as language loss in both communities, in Wyoming and here in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, there's probably less than 1% left of people who can function in the language, who were, when compared to the number of speakers that existed, 40, 50, or 60 years ago. And then forget it. I mean, if you then go back even beyond that, it's 1%. There might be three speakers left, 3 to 6 speakers left, and they're all in their late 80s. In Wyoming, it's really no better. Or small, it's better, but it's moving in the same direction. But if you go into Montana, where the Atsina are, the Grovant, they speak a dialect of Arapaho. And it's probably the oldest dialect of Arapaho. They were down to about 6 speakers, and two families just threw themselves in the language, and now they're generating speakers. So last night I was up at Canton doing a language class with about 20 people. In roughly about 100 minutes with the people that were there, they were exposed to and have cognition of over 50 phrases in Arapaho in 100 minutes. You know, I've long been concerned about the Arapaho language, and I'm here. I want to set a fire under people about the language to get them to have them see that learning language is possible. It's fun. We had fun last night. This 9-year-old girl literally burned through 40 phrases in about 12 minutes. I know she's all jazzed up and ready to, she wants more. I know it. This is one of the things that I want. But on a sidebar, this is going to sound odd. I have had contact with people who are working with dolphins, and some of them think that what I have developed for language acquisition can work with dolphins. And so I'm slowly moving in a direction to see if I can break that language communication barrier between dolphins and humans. Initially, the idea was to do it to show native communities that if a dolphin can understand Arapaho and follow directions in Arapaho and cross-communicate, then people can do it. People can do it too. Chehanana eti haka hetanati danin nana hetanati danin. So what I said was speak your language because your life is your language.